So we're talking about using VBA to create buttons for super fast data inputs. And in the first video, we looked at using VBA just to copy paste a button. That's as far as we've got so far. We've got a nice routine just to copy paste a button. But now we want to take this further and we want to get the routine to copy paste multiple buttons and then to position them on the spreadsheet so they're nicely lined up, so we don't have to do any annoying mouse work lining things up. So let's get into the spreadsheet. This is what we've got so far. I have created a routine to delete the buttons. I'm not going to go through that in this video series, but it's in the download file, a routine to delete the buttons apart from the first button I created. So it will delete all the buttons and leave one button there. So this is what we've got. I'm just going to run the copy paste buttons macro a few times just to remind you what it does. So we are just copy pasting the buttons. The buttons are just appearing on the spreadsheet, but they're not lining up as we want them to line up. So how might we go about controlling the position of the buttons? Well, let's look at the top and left properties of buttons or of shapes, the top and left properties. So just as an example, I'm going to say message box selection dot top, and let's run this code again. I'm going to use the F8 key, that's F8, to step through the code. So we can see we've created a new shape there, and then this message box selection dot top line. So that's what it returns. This message box selection dot top. It gives us a message box and puts a number in the message box. That number is 111. So what do you think that number is? Let's just run the code again. This time we've got 123. Let's run the code one more time. This time the message box has returned 135. So what do you think that number might be? Well, hopefully it's fairly clear, but Excel is telling us the position of the shape and specifically how far down the spreadsheet the shape is. That's what this dot top property is. Let's try the dot left property as well. Let's run this a few times. Okay, we've got 126. Run it again. I think it's going to be higher this time. This time we've got 138. That's because the shapes are moving further left across the spreadsheet. So this is a really interesting, super powerful property that we can harness to position the buttons, and it doesn't just work for shapes. Excel knows the position, the left and the top properties of all of the objects in the spreadsheet, including the cells. I'm going to harness that later on to get the shapes positioned correctly. So what might the next step be? So we'd like to position the shapes nicely in a line below button 2. I'm just going to clear out the buttons using the delete button macro. So we want to position the shape in line with button 2. How might we do that? Well, why don't we find out button 2's left and top properties. That's going to be useful to us because we can then use that to position the other buttons. So let's have message box. Let's just try shapes button 2 dot left. I'll just put that at the top of the routine so that line executes first. Okay, step into the routine, F8 key. I think I'm going to have to say active sheet dot shapes there. There we go. Move the VBA editor back into your screenshot. Okay, let's try that again. Reset the code. There we go. So we've got 54. So that's the left property of button 2. There we go. And that's going to be useful positioning the buttons. We want the buttons to be in a line. So what is the left property of all the buttons going to be? Well, if we want them to display in a line, then the left property of all the buttons is going to be the same. So that 54 figure, the left property of button 2 is 54. So let's use that use that 54 figure later in the code. I'm just going to make this first line an annotation so that Excel ignores it. Now we've got this new line of code here, selection.left equals 54. So the selection is going to be the shape that Excel creates with the ActiveSheet.paste command. That's going to be the selection. And with this line of code, we are setting the left property of the selection to 54, which should, in theory, line it up with button 2. So let's try playing the code, see what happens. Okay, we can see those buttons being created, whereas previously those buttons were kind of cascading across the sheet. Now, because we're setting the left property of the selection of the new button as it's created, it's now nicely in line with the other buttons. So that's an example of how we can harness the left property to position shapes. Really powerful technique. But we're not quite there yet, because we actually want the shapes to line up, or the buttons rather, we want the buttons to line up with the cells. You can remember when I've created button 2, I used the Alt key to make sure that it lined up with the cell. That's going to be important now. You'll see why that's important now, because the subsequent buttons will line up with the cells below the cell where button 2 is, and that's going to give us this nice display, all of the buttons beautifully lined up. That only works because initially I made sure that button 2 fitted perfectly in cell B4 by holding down the Alt key and locking it to the cell. So make sure you use the Alt key when you create new buttons. But what might our options be? Well, I mentioned previously that Excel knows the position of all the objects in the spreadsheet, including cells. So that's intriguing for us. Could we use the cell property, so the left and top property of the cells, to help position the buttons? If we can do that, then the position of the buttons and the cells would be exactly the same, and it should display perfectly. So that's our challenge. Let's try to do that. How might we do that? Well, let's try selection.left. So in English, and it's always a good idea to just say out loud in English what you're trying to do, it gets it clear in your head. We want to say, make the left property of the button equal to the left property of a certain cell. So let's try range, let's try B6 dot left. There we go. Okay, let's run through this code. So what would we expect to happen? Well, we would expect the button to line up with B6. Let's step into the code again. And there we go. That seems to be working well. Just to prove that, let's change this to C6 now. And then going back through the code, stepping into, using the F8 key, stepping through the code. We can see now button 2 is lining up with C6. Okay, that's because we changed the code. You should experiment with this. Try some different cells and you'll get a feel for how this is working. So that's pretty good, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to use a different referencing technique to reference the cell. And this is going to, when we incorporate a loop into this, this is going to allow us to get everything working using the variable. Don't worry about that yet, though that will come clear as we go along. We're going to use a different referencing technique, use the cells technique to reference the cell. And if we use cells, we give cells and then 2 numbers, and that helps Excel understand which cell we're talking about. So here we're talking about cell, let's go for cell B8. So cell B8 is 8 rows down the spreadsheet and 2 columns across the spreadsheet. So that's how we would reference cell B8 using this cells referencing technique. So let's try that again. And let's try the top property too. I'm going to copy paste this line. Always recycle when you're coding if you can. Copy paste this line and change this to top, and change this to top too. So what are we expecting to happen now? We're expecting, I'm going to clear out this line of code that I don't need. We're expecting a new button to be copy pasted. Then we're expecting Excel to position the button and to make the positioning of the button the same as the positioning of cell B8. And cell B8 is 8 rows down 2 rows across the spreadsheet. Now, because the button and the cell are the same size, that should lead to perfect alignment, a really neat and tidy look. That's what's supposed to happen, but often it doesn't happen as planned in VBA, so let's step into it, see what happens. So we've got our button there. Now we've done the left positioning on the previous line. Now we're going to execute the final line. And there we've done the top, so the vertical positioning. And we can see, if we just go into the spreadsheet, we can see that this button is exactly aligned with cell 8. So this is exactly what we're looking for and looks good. Okay, that's as far as we're going to go in this video, but we've harnessed 2 really powerful properties of objects in Excel that are going to help you position things, line up things really neatly. The important points here: remember to use the Alt key when you create a button and lock the size of the button to the cell, and then you can use the top and left properties to position the button and to make the positioning the same as the positioning of the cell, which will create that beautiful, clean, tidy and neat alignment. So we've been working with single buttons and positioning them, but the challenge now is we want to create and position multiple buttons. That's going to mean introducing loops into this code. That's what we're going to do in the next video. See you then.